Hey there, thanks for swinging by again. I'm thrilled you're here today because I've got a fresh tale to spin for you. So let's dive right in. I'm Benjamin, a pretty reserved guy who's happiest keeping to myself. I'm an author, and my job calls for long stretches of alone time, which fits me like a glove. Putting words on the page is my sanctuary. It's where everything clicks for me. Crowded parties and chit-chat? Not my scene at all. The clamor, the forced smiles, the effort to act like I'm hooked on topics I couldn't care less about, it wears me out. So, I dodge those whenever I can get away with it. Now, there was a time when something meant more to me than my writing, my marriage. Yep, I said was. My wife, Penelope, and I have been hitched for quite a while, but if I'm laying it all out here, we stopped being a true team ages ago. We didn't bicker much, if at all, but we didn't really connect either. We just shared a house, drifting along. Somewhere down the line, the spark we used to have faded into the growing gap between us. Penelope's the opposite of me. She's bold, driven, always in the thick of things. She's got this fast-moving consulting gig that always seemed to pull her away more than I ever could. Late nights at work turned into her regular routine, with meetings that never ended and business trips that dragged on way longer than they needed to. At first, I'd poke around with questions. Why is it always so late? Couldn't you wrap things up earlier? When are we going to carve out some time together? But her responses were predictable, like a broken record. After a while, I quit bothering. I got fed up with the justifications and came to terms with the real deal. She wasn't making time for me because she didn't want to. So, I sank deeper into my own little universe, writing, reading, soaking up the quiet my work thrives on. It was simpler that way, less heartache. Then, one night, Penelope brought up this company party. She didn't just toss out an invite. She all but dragged me into it, insisting I show up. Said it'd do me good, a chance to rub elbows with some sharp minds from her field, a networking thing I had zero interest in. Schmoozing with suits and faking enthusiasm for their corporate game plans? Hard pass. I wasn't itching to widen my circle, but the way she pressed it gave me pause. It wasn't a casual nudge, it felt urgent, almost like she was ordering me to go. For the first time in forever, it seemed like she was reaching out, maybe trying to patch things up. Perhaps this was her awkward attempt to draw me into her orbit, something I'd begged her to do for me way back when. A tiny piece of me, the part still holding out hope our marriage could be rescued, clung to that idea. All right, so after a bit of hemming and hawing, I caved and told Penelope I'd tag along. I wasn't exactly jumping for joy about it, but if there was even a sliver of hope that this might nudge us toward patching things up, I figured I could stomach a couple hours of fake grins and chit-chat. Looking back, I had no clue that saying yes to that party would kick off the unraveling of everything we'd built. We rolled up to the venue looking like we had it all together. Penelope had gone full glam in this sleek, eye-catching dress that turned heads the second we walked through the door. I'd made an effort too, sliding into a sharp suit, even though I couldn't have cared less about impressing anyone there. The party was exactly what you'd picture for some big-shot corporate shindig, fancy, polished, packed with slick professionals and expensive outfits. It was the kind of place where folks tossed around words like stocks and mergers over glasses of wine that cost more than my weekly grocery bill. Penelope didn't waste a second before dragging me around, introducing me to her work crew. Their reactions were like a script, first surprise, then this polite interest. Oh, so you're Benjamin. We've heard tons about you. Great to finally put a face to the name. I'd nod, shake a hand, toss out a few nice to meet yous. Clearly, I was a bit of a curiosity, the elusive husband they'd only caught whispers of, the guy who never bothered showing up to these things. A few of them got nosy, asking about my writing, my books, or whatever they figured I'd bite on. To my surprise, I didn't totally hate it. I actually found myself chatting more than I'd planned. Maybe this night wouldn't be a total wash after all. Things were going better than I'd braced for. I wouldn't call it fun, but I'd eased into the vibe. The talks weren't unbearable, the drinks were solid, and for once, Penelope seemed to notice I was there, part of her world. I wasn't dumb enough to think one evening would glue our fractured marriage back together, but for a fleeting second, I let myself wonder if this could be the start of something turning around. It was all humming along nicely. Penelope even shot me a few looks here and there, maybe happy I was playing along. Then the mood shifted. The music switched up, the lights dipped a little lower, and couples started drifting onto the dance floor, pairing off like it was the natural next step. I wasn't really tuned into the dance floor until I spotted this guy heading our way. He didn't even glance at me, just strolled right up to Penelope like I wasn't standing there. "Shall we?" he said, his voice all smooth and cocky, stretching out his hand as if her answer was a done deal. For a heartbeat, I waited for her to brush him off, maybe chuckle, and stay put by my side. I figured she'd tell him she was here with her husband, no thanks. But nope, she flashed a smile, ready to take his offer. Before I could think, my instincts kicked in. I grabbed her wrist, firm but steady, holding her back before she could move an inch. My voice came out low even. "You're not going anywhere." That's when the guy, Simon, I'd find out later, finally noticed me. He tilted his head my way, sizing me up, but kept his mouth shut at first. I didn't budge. "If you're gonna dance with my wife, at least have the decency to do it right, or don't bother," I told him, staring him down. That should have settled it, but it didn't. Penelope whipped around to face me, her expression all twisted up with irritation and fury. "What's wrong with you?" she snapped, yanking her arm free from my grip. "You're making me look ridiculous." I stared at her, stunned by how she just shrugged me off. Then she turned back to Simon, brushing by me like I was some annoying roadblock. She was about to walk off with him, right there in front of me, no guilt, no second thoughts. Something broke loose inside me. Take one step, and I'm done with this marriage, I warned, my voice sharp enough to cut through the noise. That's when Simon finally turned to me fully, locking eyes with me. In this calm, cold tone, he said, "You've always been spineless. You won't do a thing." Without blinking, he reached for Penelope's hand, tugged her along, and just like that, she went with him. The sting of humiliation hit me hard, crashing down like a wave, but I wasn't about to let them see me crack. I refused to be the idiot who lost it in a room full of her fancy coworkers. So, I spun on my heel and walked out alone. Later that night, when Penelope finally strolled back home, I was still wide awake. The front door creaked open, and I caught the sharp click of her heels against the wood floor echoing through the house. I'd spent those hours turning everything over in my head, decisions settling into place, but sleep wouldn't come near me. A few minutes later, she appeared in the bedroom doorway, arms crossed tight. I braced myself for some flimsy excuse or at least a half-hearted explanation for what went down at the party. Instead, she launched into a full-on rant, her words flying at me like arrows. I just sat there, letting her vent without cutting in. "You humiliated me," Penelope snapped, her eyes blazing with bitterness. "You kicked up a fuss over nothing, and then just bailed. Left me hanging at my own work event." I stood there, taking it all in without a word. In her head, she was the one wronged, and I'd somehow trashed everything. Listening to her go on, it hit me like a ton of bricks. Penelope didn't respect me anymore, not as her husband, not even as a person. A marriage without that mutual respect is like a rickety shack built on shaky dirt, bound to collapse sooner or later. I realized arguing with her right then would be a waste of breath. She'd already crowned herself the victor, and no amount of back and forth was going to budge her. Instead, her biting words just locked in what I'd been suspecting for a while. Her actions and her dodging accountability had pretty much sealed the coffin on us. But before I could tackle the mess of our relationship head-on, there was another loose end to tie up: Simon. I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for a fight, but I'm also not one to let someone stomp all over my boundaries without pushing back. Simon had waltzed right over the line at that party, acting like he could take what he wanted because he pegged me as too feeble to stop him. That smug attitude was his first big misstep, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I made up my mind right then. I wouldn't let anyone walk over me like that, and I'd do what it took to make him answer for it. The next morning, Penelope barely gave me a flicker of acknowledgement. No good morning. No casual chatter, just this icy, hollow silence. She floated around the house like I was invisible, banging drawers a little too loud, letting out these exaggerated sighs to make sure I knew she was still mad about the party. I didn't bite. I was already checked out of whatever mind game she was running. My head was somewhere else entirely. By noon, I took action. I reached out to a private investigator and laid it out plain and simple. I wanted the full scoop on Simon. Every grimy detail, every hidden flaw. Where he crashes, who he hangs with, where he burns his nights. I told the guy if there's dirt to dig up, I want it handed to me. He didn't pry, just gave a nod and got started. Days dragged by, and Penelope kept up her frosty silent treatment, but it didn't faze me. I hardly registered it. I was too focused, waiting for the investigator to come through. Weeks later, the report landed. Turns out Simon's got a wife and 3 kids, a picture-perfect family, judging by the photos, with a spouse who seems totally clueless about the creep she's tied to. But that's just the start. Simon's got a track record, complaints from women at his job about him crossing lines, some hushed up with settlements, others swept under the rug. It's a whole streak of shady behavior, tucked away behind stacks of paperwork and corporate shrugs. But the real gut punch, the proof of his affairs, piles of photos, stacks of videos, all laying out his side escapades and a long trail of sketchy behavior at work. Different women, different spots, hotels, lounges, even sneaky late-night meetups in empty parking lots. And there, smack in the middle of it all, was my wife, Penelope. The timestamps didn't lie. She'd been tangled up with him too. Seeing that hit me hard, cracked my heart open, but I didn't let it swallow me whole. I'd had my suspicions for a while, and now here it was, cold, hard evidence. Simon didn't know it yet, but his days were numbered. I decided the first move had to hit close to home. His wife deserved to see the guy she'd vowed to stand by for what he really was. I put together a little care package, a USB drive stuffed with pics and clips of Simon in places no married man should be messing around in. He'd been sloppy, and I had the proof to show for it. I scribbled a quick note to go with it. You deserve better. Then I paid a delivery guy to drop it right on her doorstep, no questions asked. I gave it a few days to simmer, let the chaos unfold in their house. Let her wrestle with the sting of betrayal. Maybe she tore into him. Maybe she grabbed the kids and bolted. I didn't know, and honestly, I didn't care. That was their mess to sort out. But I wasn't done. Simon had more to lose than just his family. I was gunning for his job next. I started firing off emails to his company's HR crew, anonymous tips spelling out his history of workplace harassment, how he'd been cozying up to coworkers, and the way he leaned on his title to keep women quiet. One email wouldn't cut it. Companies don't jump on a single gripe, so I ramped it up. I set up a bunch of fake accounts, each one dishing out a slightly different slice of the evidence, all written like they came from fed-up employees sick of the poison Simon spread. The pressure built, and it worked like a charm. The company couldn't ignore it anymore. They had to dig in. Quiet rumors turned into formal sit-downs. Simon was under the microscope, getting grilled, every move picked apart. It took a month, but the hammer finally dropped. He was out of a job. Penelope didn't walk away clean either. The company put her and a few other women tied up in the office flings on suspension. Maybe they were still figuring out what to do with them, or maybe it was a wake-up call to rethink their paths. Either way, the fallout had landed. The day Simon got the axe, Penelope trudged through our front door looking wiped out. I already knew the whole story, why he'd been canned, why she'd been sidelined. I'd had people on the inside feeding me every juicy detail. The emails, the investigation, the final call. Penelope hadn't breathed a word about it, but I could read it all over her face. I stayed put, watching her from the other side of the room. Tough day, huh? I asked, keeping my tone steady and calm. She let out a scoff, shooting me a weary sidelong glance. You don't even know the half of it, she muttered. I leaned forward just a touch. Oh, I might have a clue. Simon's out the door, right? And you're on suspension? Her body went rigid for a split second before she forced out a laugh. Oh, here we go again, she said, shaking her head as she headed for the kitchen, acting like my words hadn't just landed. But I wasn't letting her slip away that easy. How long were you with him, Penelope? That froze her in place. She spun around, laughing again, but this time it had a shaky, nervous edge. Are you still harping on this? Seriously, Benjamin, you're obsessed. You've been jealous and sour ever since that party. I didn't flinch, just held her gaze. She folded her arms tight. All I did was dance with the guy, and you've blown it up into some wild story in your head, she said, giving me this pitying look, like I was some delusional sap spinning tales. You freaked out that night, and now you're playing detective in some cheesy TV drama. I didn't raise my voice or argue back. Instead, I reached into my drawer, pulled out the folder, and let it thud onto the table in front of her. Photos spilled out. Penelope's face went white as a sheet. She was speechless for once. Then the flip switched, tears welled up, her voice trembled. Benjamin, why would you do this? She choked out, stepping closer, her words soaked in panic. You've wrecked everything, my career, my life. Was that your plan? To ruin me. I let her unload, let her pin it all on me for dragging her secrets into the light, stuff she thought she'd buried deep. The divorce papers will be ready soon, I said, my voice flat and final. If you've got an issue with that, take it up in court. Then I turned and walked off, leaving her standing there, alone, stewing in the mess she'd made. Now that it's all out in the open, I want to wrap this up with some takeaways from my story. You might nod along with me, or maybe you'll disagree, but here's what I learned, my truths from this whole ordeal. First off, disrespect is the opening act to betrayal. The second Penelope stepped onto that dance floor with Simon, our marriage was already toast. It wasn't just about the dance, it was what that moment meant. A wife who values her husband doesn't even entertain another guy's offer, especially not right in front of him. That she even thought about it, let alone went through with it, laid it all bare for me. Second, people reveal who they really are. You've just got to trust what you see. Penelope had been pulling away long before that night. The late hours, the excuses, the way I always seemed to fall off her radar, those weren't random flukes. They were signals, ones I brushed off because I clung to hope things could still turn around. But when someone keeps showing you they don't care, it's because you're not on their list. I should have faced that sooner, but when the reality finally smacked me, I didn't duck it. Third, revenge hits hardest when it's ice cold. That night at the party, I felt small, helpless. Simon stared me down, called me a weakling, and for a moment, I bought it. But letting my temper run wild would have made me sloppy. Instead, I bided my time, dug up the dirt, and planned every step to carry weight. Patience flipped that one humiliating moment into a total takedown. Simon lost his job, his marriage is likely crumbling, and Penelope? She got what was coming. Finally, time spent setting things right is never wasted. Some folks might say I poured too much into this, that I should have just walked away and let it go. Maybe they've got a point. But when someone disrespects you to your face, when they make it clear you don't matter to them, taking back your dignity isn't optional, it's the only path. I refuse to be the guy who let himself get trampled, and I don't regret a single minute of it. So that's my story. What do you think? Was I in the right to handle it this way, or should I have played it differently? Drop your thoughts. I'm curious to hear where you land.